Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. Now, this week I'm going to be diving into the crime scene analysis and the decision making, and also the law enforcement response in the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. Now, last week I dropped an episode on the 911 analysis, or my analysis of that 911 call that Alec Murdaugh made, claiming that he had discovered the bodies of Maggie and Paul. And I'm curious, what did you think about it? I shared a lot of unique insight and analysis. And like I said, it's often not what people do, it's actually what they don't do. And there was some leakage there too. And behaviourally, we can leak things. And actually, Alec Murdaugh leaks quite a lot at times. He's very conscious of the impression that he makes. But you're going to hear much more about that, particularly when I get onto the police interviews and interrogations. Now, the other thing to say about the 911 call is that I have heard some professionals who work in the criminal justice system and who have a podcast and who've been talking about this case say that the 911 call doesn't matter and that behaviour is voodoo and that it's just not relevant and it's junk science. And I just want to say that that is absolute nonsense. The 911 call in every case is really important. Okay, it's often the start point for an investigation, and here you have a potential suspect making a 911 call, and we've seen that numerous times with cases, and so it's really important to analyse what's said, and not just analyse what's said, but compare it to what's said on interview, for example, and continuous interview and interrogation, and also at trial. It can be used to corroborate things, or it can be used to challenge the timeline, for example. So it's often the first statement that a suspect might make if they've made the 911 call. So it's really important, actually, and it matters a lot. It matters what someone says, it matters what they don't do. Everything about it is very important to a case. So, like I said, this week I'm going to be deconstructing the crime scene and sharing my analysis and insight, and also the decision-making, but law enforcement's response, which was really curious to me when I watched the body-worn camera footage. And there are two body-worn cameras, and I've looked at both of them. And I'll come back to that, but what I'll also say is that, this could be an upsetting episode for some, getting into the crime scene behaviour and the victims of what happened, and it might be upsetting. And murder is upsetting and distressing. It's horrific. It's traumatic. It's grisly. It is not fun. Or, fun, I say in inverted commas, or light entertainment, and it shouldn't be treated as that. We should honour the victims when we talk about them. And for Maggie and Paul, what I will share with you is that it was painful what happened to them, and not just was it incredibly painful, they at some point would have been conscious and aware of what was happening, and that it wasn't just intended to hurt them, but intended to kill them. So it would have been terrifying and terrorising. Make no mistake about that. So before I get into it, I also just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's subscribed to Crime Analyst. Please continue to leave your comments. And if you haven't subscribed just yet, what are you waiting for? Hit the button and share my analysis with other people as well. Share Crime Analyst YouTube with people. I'm still trying to grow the channel, and I think it's important that good knowledge is put out there, and I am trying to raise awareness. And also my work is unique because I come from a perspective of not just behavioural analysis but early identification and intervention and prevention. And I do believe we can prevent a lot of murders in slow motion, and I'll say more about that. And with this case, what I'll also share is that I wasn't privy to the full case file. And normally I am when I'm working on a case, and not just a case file, but I'll actually go to the crime scene. And I like to go to the crime scene because a picture paints 1,000 words, but going to the scene yourself paints 1,000,000. And that's always a very important part of my casework. But that having been said, this case is behaviourally rich. There is so much information, from the 911 call to the interviews, the interrogations of Paul Murdaugh, and of course all the trial material. So it takes a long time to sift through to assess, to analyse, to assimilate and distill, and for my analytical process, for it all to start to make sense, to write something comprehensive, like I would write a report. So it's very time consuming, and I get into flow, FLOW, where I'm really in it and I live it and I breathe it, and that's all I think about. And then it might be at 3 a.m, something comes to me of what made sense or what doesn't make sense about a case. And even when I'm talking like this, I'm in flow, right? So I do just want to say that I misspoke in part 1 and I said Gloria's surname wrong. And I do just want to make mention of that. Her name is Gloria Sattlefield, and I want to offer my sincere apologies for that, and to Gloria's family. It's very hard when you go into flow, and sometimes your brain can jump, particularly when you're concentrating for very long periods of time. But it is important. The detail is important. I don't just read from a script. I'm talking to you. And again, I go into flow, and this is my unique insight and analysis. I'm not reading off Wikipedia or somebody's report or article, a journalist's work. That's not what I do. So everything that you're hearing is unique. Okay, so that was a longer introduction than anticipated, but you can see that I want to explain things in detail to you, and I really value my YouTube community. So thank you so much for subscribing, and do leave a comment. And with that having been said, let's dive back into this horrific case. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to share my thoughts and analysis regarding the crime scene and also law enforcement's response. And for those of you who may be new to Crime Analyst and you've come because you're interested in this case specifically, firstly, I want to say welcome. And I also just want to let you know that I do go into the granular detail of cases, not to be gratuitous or sensationalist, but because the body and the crime scene holds up a mirror to the perpetrator or perpetrators. You see, every decision is a choice. Every action taken is a direct reflection of the perpetrator or perpetrators, and there's an imprint that betrays them. You just have to know what the signs are and how to interpret them, and that's where experience of working cases comes in. You see, a particular victim is targeted at a particular time at a particular location for a particular reason. Just reflect on that for a moment. And in this case, I talked about victimology in part 1, and that's where I always begin, with the victims. Now, in this case, the two victims, Maggie and Paul, are from a very powerful family, arguably the most powerful and influential family in the Low Country. Listening to local people talk about the Murdaugh family, there were many people who were intimidated and scared of the Murdaughs. So that's important to remember, context. And so the question that's uppermost in my mind right now is who would have the gumption to go onto the Murdaugh property, go to the kennels and lay in wait for Maggie and Paul on the off chance that they'd be together at the dog kennels at the same time in order to be there and shoot them dead. Now bear in mind that the Murdaugh sprawling estate sits on 1,700 acres of land and features a farm, 2 miles of river frontage for freshwater fishing and kayaking, dog kennels, plenty of turkey and deer for on-site hunting, and the custom-built home newly constructed in 2011. And it's surrounded by woods. Now, having looked at some drone footage of the Moselle property showing the family home in relation to the dog kennels where the victims were killed, the kennels are about 1/4 mile from the property. So that's important to know. And we also have to think about the victims and the location and the timeline. Who knew that Maggie and Paul were at the kennels at Moselle at that particular time on that particular evening? You see, when you add in the timeline of both Maggie and Paul being there at the exact time, together, the chance of the killer or killers fortuitously stumbling upon them is highly unlikely. It's possible, but it's not probable. And remember that Maggie was living separately from Alec Murdaugh at the family's home in Edisto Beach, and that she'd only gone to Moselle on the night of her death reluctantly, and on Alec Murdaugh's request, because he said that his father had been taken into hospital and he was very ill. So Maggie went to Moselle at short notice. She had texted back and forth with Paul and told him that she was having her nails done. Alec Murdaugh texted and called her too. Now, Maggie had spoken with her sister Marion a number of times as well, and Marion actually persuaded Maggie to go and support Murdaugh that night. So to answer the question, who knew that Maggie was there? To me, it sounds like only three people: Paul, Marion, and Alec Murdaugh. Now, Alec Murdaugh claimed that he, Paul, and Maggie had had dinner together that night. And of course, that's his narrative. And he said a lot of things about that night, many of which have been proven to be lies, and I'm going to go through and highlight some of those lies. There's evidence from text messages between Maggie and Paul that Blanca, the family housekeeper, had made dinner for Paul. At 6:01 p.m, Maggie texts Paul, "Love you, and Blanca cooked you dinner." At 6:23 and 27 seconds, Paul texts Maggie, "What did she make?" At 6:23 and 48 seconds, Maggie replied to Paul, "Country fried steak and mac and cheese." What she doesn't say is that Blanca made us dinner and I'll be there at X time. So it doesn't sound to me like they were all having dinner together. And let's remember, Maggie and Paul were murdered in the same event, and Marion, Maggie's sister, who knew Maggie was at Murdaugh, had an alibi that night and had no motive, no means or opportunity to kill Maggie and Paul. Alex Murdaugh, however, had all three. And I'm going to tell you more about that. So I want to talk about the crime scene next, because the crime scene tells its own story about what happened. On the evening of the 7th of June 2021, Maggie got to Murdaugh at around 8:15 p.m. Paul was already there. Each of their phones, Paul's, Maggie's, and Alec Murdaugh's, also tell their own story about what happened that night. And I'm going to share and decipher those stories too. Paul was on his phone just minutes before he was killed. He was taken by surprise and didn't see it coming. There were no defensive injuries. Paul was found lying face down, and his body was just outside the feed room. The killer shot him in the chest first, and then the head. He was shot twice at close range with a shotgun. Now, the way that Paul was killed, at close range, leads me to believe that Paul was likely the primary target, and I believe he was shot first. And I'm sorry to be graphic here, but the first round hit him in the chest from several feet away, and he was most likely heading for the door of the feed room before the second round was discharged and hit him in the neck and shoulder, which blew out Paul's brain and immediately killed him. The killer literally blew his brains out. That's why it's clear to me that he was the primary target. It was, some might say, a shocking execution-style murder. The type of shocking execution-style murder where you might conclude this was a revenge kill that's emotionally charged. A revenge kill for punishment and retribution. Maggie was shot 5 times, and 2 of those shots were fatal. It's believed that the first fatal shot came from behind. It grazed her stomach and went through her breast, into her jaw, and into her brain. The killer then circled around Maggie and shot her in the crown of the head. One of the law enforcement officers at the scene said Maggie had, and I quote, "a big hole in the back of her head." The killer used an AR-style rifle. She had been shot with 300 blackout ammunition. Maggie was killed execution-style. So there were 2 different weapons that were used to kill Paul and Maggie, and 2 different types of ammunition. Now, this is unusual given these circumstances, and due to this, one might infer that there were 2 separate shooters. Or another hypothesis that seems much more likely to me is that this was a staged crime scene. The killer wanted to make it look like it was 2 shooters, and that it was a revenge execution. Due to this, law enforcement would look outside the home for the killers, rather than inside the home. Now, I've seen this in numerous cases. The problem here is that the evidence fights itself. Now, the murder weapons were never found. In other words, whoever killed them took the weapons with them. The Murdaughs had a lot of guns. In fact, they had 3 custom-built AR-15 blackout rifles, but only 1 could be accounted for after the shootings. Also, law enforcement looked for the casings at the scene, and they found older casings in the grounds, some from AR-15s which matched the casings from the crime scene. This proved it was one of the Murdaugh guns that was used to kill Maggie, and not a weapon brought to the scene. Also, the blackout ammunition that was used to kill Maggie is quite rare, and not typically used with AR-15s. So that's significant. The same ammunition, the same brand and caliber was found throughout the property. Federal ammunition that was used to kill Paul was much more common. So what happened to the weapons? Well, I'll come on to that. Everything about this crime scene points to 22-year-old Paul being the primary target. He was literally obliterated with a shotgun at close range. His head was blown off. That takes a lot to do that. The mechanics of doing that. Now, as I said before, people's reaction to this case, the fact that when they say, I just don't understand how Paul's father, Alec Murdaugh, could ever do that. How could he ever do that? No father could or would ever do that. Well, I believe that's exactly what Murdaugh was relying on. Knowing people as well as he did and their emotions, that was most likely his intention in my opinion. And he coolly planned and executed this. The evidence indicates to me that he staged the scene so that all the evidence pointed outside the home, to two shooters wanting revenge and retribution. And he also worked really hard to convince people that he wasn't there. He told Colleton County Sheriff Sergeant Daniel Green, who was one of the first officers on the scene, that he hadn't seen Maggie and Paul in the 45 minutes before he left to see his mother. But that was a lie. I mentioned Paul was on his phone just before he was shot dead, and I believe the lethal attack came completely out the blue. And what's more, it came out of the blue from someone he trusted. Why do I believe this? Well, Paul's phone tells that story. At 8:44 p.m. and 55 seconds, Paul took a video of a dog to send to a friend. On that video, you can hear Maggie's voice, Paul's voice, and Alec Murdaugh's voice. They're talking about one of the dogs and trying to troubleshoot what's wrong with the dog. So, Alec Murdaugh lied about being there with them that night just before they were killed. Paul's video places his father there at the scene just minutes before he was shot dead. That's hugely significant. Murdaugh was caught in a lie. So we have an understanding now of what he sounds like when he lies. That's important. And it's important to acknowledge and consider, if Murdaugh lied about this, what else did he lie about? And why would he lie about this? What's the purpose of the lie? So this is really important information to assimilate going forward when analysing a case like this. And why would he leave it an hour to call 911? And for me, there's only one viable reason. It's hugely significant at 8:49 p.m. and 1 second, Paul's phone locked and went dark forever. And at 8:49 p.m. and 39 seconds, Maggie's phone locked and went dark forever. Within seconds of each other, Paul and Maggie's phones went dark. That's significant. That corroborates the likely sequence of events. Paul was killed first, unexpectedly, and then Maggie. So Paul's video directly contradicts what Alec Murdaugh said on the 911 call. That 911 call that he made at 10:07 p.m. when he said that he arrived there and discovered his wife and son had been shot badly. That was an out-and-out lie. And I've not finished talking about the phones just yet. There's more. Now, when Alec Murdaugh was at the kennels, he didn't have his phone on him. Interestingly, his phone showed no activity between 8:09 p.m. and 9:02 p.m. that night. So not only was his phone not on his person, but it was dark across the time that Maggie and Paul were killed. That's significant, and it's also strange for a prolific phone user. So this, again, is when baseline behaviour is important to know. It also tells me that Alec Murdaugh had thought about the murders and pre-planned them, and that he employed countermeasures to reduce the chances of being caught. That's really important, and it means that everything he said and everything he did must be rigorously questioned, challenged, and corroborated. His account is not credible, and he can't be trusted. At 9:04 p.m, Alec Murdaugh called Maggie's phone. She didn't answer. At 9:06 p.m, Murdaugh called his father, Randolph, and then called Maggie again. At 9:06 p.m, Murdaugh's car was turned on. He texted Maggie and told her that he was off to see his mother. Now, my question here is, if you're trying to let both Maggie and Paul know where you're going, i.e. you thought it important enough that you called Maggie more than twice, then why not just go to the kennels en route and let them know? But that's not what Murdaugh did on his way to his mother's house. He just kept calling and texting. Now, he arrived at his mother's house at 9:21 p.m. He's there for roughly 20 minutes. He called other people during that time, and then he arrived back at Moselle at 10:01, and he called 911 at 10:07 p.m. His mother had Alzheimer's, and that was his supposedly cast iron alibi. A mother with Alzheimer's. You literally cannot make this up. But even that tells me a lot about him. The fact that he thought that that would work, that that would be enough, that reveals his hubris and entitlement. Well, when you place it in context, it makes sense, because previously everything Murdaugh said was believed and went unchallenged. That had worked for him his entire life, so he most likely thought it would work for him again now. And I believe Murdaugh thought he had taken care of the phones. Well, his phone and Maggie's at least. Maggie's phone was discovered on a roadside about a quarter mile from the crime scene the following afternoon, whilst Paul's was found resting on his back after Murdaugh told the police that it fell out of his dead son's pocket when he checked on him. Now, he also said something else about that, which I found interesting, and I'll get to that in next week's episode. Now, Maggie's phone told a story of its own. Maggie's phone went dark within seconds of Paul's going dark. After 8:49 p.m, Paul's phone shows no more activity. However, his mother's phone continued to record movement, steps, and orientation changes. Between 8:53 p.m. and 15 seconds and 8:55 p.m. and 32 seconds, Maggie's phone is picked up and travels 52 steps. It's counting steps, and in this time it changes orientation to portrait. At 8:54 p.m. and 32 seconds, the phone changed to landscape when it's put down. At 8:54 p.m. and 34 seconds, the camera came on for 1 second. The phone was trying to do Face ID. Now, if it were Maggie's face, it would most likely have unlocked. But it wasn't Maggie's face. At 8:54 p.m. and 44 seconds, the phone is picked up and changed to portrait, and activity showed steps and distance travelled. At 9 p.m. to 9:02 p.m, the same 9:02 p.m. that Alec Murdaugh's phone springs back to life. At 9:06 p.m. and 20 seconds, Maggie's phone stopped recording portrait mode, and at 9:06 p.m. and 12 seconds, the orientation changed again to portrait as the phone is lifted up. At 9:06 p.m. and 14 seconds, there's a missed call from Murdaugh and another missed call from him again at 9:06 p.m. and 51 seconds. So just seconds later, Murdaugh's phone calls Maggie's, and remember, his phone springs into life when Maggie's phone comes to a standstill. And that's not all. At 9:07 p.m, Maggie's phone display goes on and off, and at 9:08 p.m. and 58 seconds, Maggie's phone received an incoming text from Murdaugh which read, "Going to check on M, be right back," which was unread. At 9:31 p.m. and 44 seconds, the display comes on again, and at 9:34 p.m. and 14 seconds, there's a message from Rogan, "Tell Paul to call me," which was unread. Then there's another missed call from Murdaugh at 9:45 p.m. Then Murdaugh texts Maggie again at 9:47 p.m. and 23 seconds. "Call me, babe," which was unread, and he called Maggie again at 10:03 p.m. So in total, Murdaugh called Maggie's phone 4 times and texted her twice in less than 1 hour. Now, this seems somewhat excessive to me, but I would have to understand their baseline behaviour, i.e. their messages back and forth and his behaviour, to know whether this was unusual. Also, like I said, if he wanted to reach Maggie so badly, why not just pop into the kennels before he left and tell her where he was going? To me, it just seems like an oversell. And him calling Maggie babe, given that Maggie had separated from him and they were not on good terms, this seems a little forced and not authentic to me. But maybe that's how he did address Maggie. But again, I'd have to look at baseline behaviour. One thing's for sure. Murdaugh certainly didn't bank on Paul's phone telling on him. Giving him away by capturing his voice on the video just minutes before Paul and Maggie were brutally and horrifically murdered, showing that he was there when he said that he wasn't. And remember that odd phraseology I highlighted in the previous episode, where Murdaugh overemphasises that he wasn't there, and he said it twice? That was another oversell. Here it is again. Take a listen.
Okay, did you hear anything, or did you come home and find them?
No, man, I've been gone. I just came back.
Okay, and was anyone else supposed to be at your house?
No, ma'am. Please hurry.
Now, as I said before, that stood out to me. And the long pause and the delayed "please hurry," that was said with no urgency at all. And for me, this indicated deception. Well, now we know that he lied. And this is what he sounds like when he's lying. Now, when officers arrived at the scene and they understood that Paul and Maggie were dead and Paul's brains had been blown out and that he'd been shot several times, the question is, why? Why would someone want to do that to a 22-year-old kid and a defenceless woman? The who is the next question, but the why takes you to the whom. That's why motive is so important to determine. Why would someone want to do this? Well, the crime scene analysis revealed that this wasn't just a teach you a lesson type behaviour or type offence. This reeked of pure revenge and punishment. Well, here's a reminder of what Murdaugh immediately said to Officer Daniel Green, the first responding officer at the scene.
Central 717 scene is secured. Got a Whiskey Fox, Whiskey Mike, both gunshot wounds to the head.
Sir, I wanted to let you know because of the scene, I did go get a gun and bring it down here.
It's in your vehicle? Do you have any guns on you at all?
No, sir. It's leaning up against the side of my car.
Okay. You're fine, man. You're fine. Turn around for me.
I don't have any guns.
Okay. Yes, sir. I see that. Okay. This is your wife and son?
And son.
Okay.
It's bad. It's bad. Check the pulses.
Yes, sir. This is the firearm you brought from inside the house?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I went and got. This is a long story. My son was in a boat wreck a few months back. He's been getting threats. Most of it's been benign stuff we didn't take serious.
Okay.
He's been getting punched. I know that's somebody. I know that's what it is.
How helpful and convenient of Alec Murdaugh to be there and offer that up immediately. Paul had been responsible for a boat crash, he had received threats, he'd been punched, and Alec Murdaugh knows that's what it is. That's what he said. So the next logical inference for anyone would be that the murders were related to that, and this was someone acting on that threat. And let's not forget that this isn't just some Joe Schmo. This was Alec Murdaugh saying that he knew what it was. Not that he suspected, but he knew. And as I always say, language is important. And law enforcement took the bait and ran with it. They called up all the passengers in the boat crash and Stephen Smith's mother, Sandy, and asked them about it. So let's take stock here and think about the law enforcement response. They've been called by powerful, wealthy and influential Alec Murdaugh. He called 911, a call that lasted just under 8 minutes, and by minute 3, he'd checked out and said that he was on a call, and he corrected himself and said that he had to make another call, and then promptly ended the 911 call. Then when law enforcement arrived, they established that Murdaugh said he was the last person who saw the victims alive, and he was also the person who called them to say that he discovered the bodies. Then he was allowed to walk around the crime scene as he pleased. That was staggering for me to watch. And from watching the body-worn camera footage, which I recommend all of you do, many officers pitched up and were just milling about the scene too. There was no evidence of crime scene tape, and the bodies weren't cordoned off, nor were they protected. The other bizarre aspect to the case is that they all heard on the radio that there were 2 victims with gunshot wounds to the head, yet almost every officer caught on camera said that they didn't have any crime scene logs or paper or crime scene tape. But the 911 call was very clear about the scene that they were attending. Why were they all pitching up totally ill-equipped? To me, law enforcement seemed confused about what to do. Some of the officers are on camera discussing the Murdaugh family and who they are. So some of the officers there knew exactly who they were and the power and the influence that they had. So I had to wonder, the fact that so many of them seemed ambivalent and nonchalant, was that because they just didn't want to get involved? They didn't want to put pen to paper or have their names anywhere near the case because they knew where it might well end up, and they knew that it would be a headache. You see, it might not just be a training issue. But importantly, more than half an hour passed, and then they decided to cordon off and seal the scene, including the 2 dead bodies. Now, from what I could see on the police body-worn camera footage, there appeared to be a sheet over Paul's body, rather than a tarp or a tent, which is a very odd decision, particularly on a misty, rainy night. And so that's a problem, as officers are seen lifting up the sheet and walking around the bodies with no gloves, no masks, no suits, no boots, no protective clothing of any sort that I could see. I have to say, this is just wild to me. It's one thing to be inexperienced, but it's quite another in 2021 to see officers having no regard for the preservation of a crime scene or for protecting the victims. And later on, some of Murdaugh's family turned up and his business partner, and they apparently walked through the scene. Then they all went down to the house later on, and the house wasn't cordoned off. Some even tidied the house up. Now, I have to say, I was getting Ramsey vibes from this. They too invited people over to their place when John Bonet was missing, which is such a puzzling thing to do when you're in crisis. You see, most people in this situation find it hard to deal with what's in front of them. There's just too much chaos and trauma, and they don't want to introduce more people into the equation. But not Alec Murdaugh. Murdaugh was controlling the narrative from the start. He made the 911 call, and he immediately said on the scene that he believed the boat crash was the motive, and therefore he's saying that it's his son's behaviour that's the problem. Murdaugh returned to that when he was interviewed later that night in the car at the crime scene. It was a 34-minute-long interview with South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Special Agent Dave Owens and Colleton County Sheriff's Office Detective Laura Rutland. Also in the vehicle at the time was Murdaugh's personal attorney, Danny Henderson. Now, there were a number of puzzling and bizarre and disturbing moments in that interview. There were also numerous indicators of deception across that interview in the car and an interrogation on the 11th of August. And I'm going to take apart first the interview in the car. But not now. That's next week. And there's a lot still to unravel. But let me share this with you. When asked about Murdaugh's relationship with Maggie, this is what he said.
Had Maggie and Paul been arguing over anything?
No.
What was their relationship like?
Wonderful.
Wonderful. How about yours and Maggie's?
Wonderful. I mean, I'm sure we had little things here and there, but we had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship.
Does that remind you of anyone? I'm going to share with you a case where the double killer said something very similar on his first interview when his pregnant wife was missing. Do any of you know which case I'm referring to? Now, I'll give you a clue. It's a US case, and there was overwhelming and compelling circumstantial evidence in this case. And that should tell you, because the perpetrator has been convicted, that should tell you just how important behaviour and circumstantial evidence is. Okay, so you'll hear more about that next week. Now, I hope you found this episode illuminating and fascinating, and I'm trying to break it down into bite-sized chunks because there is just so much to this case. You could go down so many rabbit holes, and I'm keeping it thematically in the categories of how I approach a case and how I work the case, so you get an understanding of what a criminal behavioural analyst would do and what I look for and the insight and knowledge that I provide in a case. And I will be returning to the crime scene and the behaviour and decision making and law enforcement's response next week. You see, I'm not done yet. It's such a big area to discuss and to break down. And I'm going to leave it there for now. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'd love it if you leave a comment below. I love hearing what you think, whether it chimes with you. I love hearing the fact that you enjoy my analysis and that you share the episodes with other people. And that is so wonderful for me because I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel as well. And I want to put the right information out there. So if you can help me with that, that's wonderful. And I really do appreciate it. Okay, so that's it for now. Until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instinct.